Black twins threatened by racist bullies, unaware they are black belt fighters. What happens when silence hides strength, and calm conceals years of deadly skill? Two black twin brothers enter a new high school and instantly become targets for a group of racist bullies. To the outside world, they're just quiet kids trying to keep their heads down. But what the bullies don't know is that these twins are black belt fighters, trained, disciplined, and deadly when pushed too far. One wrong move, and the whole power dynamic flips. Stick around, because this isn't just a story of self-defense, it's a story of unshakable dignity and the moment when true strength speaks without saying a word. Would you like a matching closing narration in the same tone? You've seen it before. The loudest voices in the room. The toughest-looking guys always trying to impose their will. But this time, it's different. Two twins, calm and collected, walking through the schoolyard, unaware that a group of bullies has already chosen them as their next target. What they don't know, what none of them know, is that these twins are no strangers to power. They've been trained, disciplined, and when the first shove comes, it's not fear they show. It's something much more dangerous. One move, that's all it takes for everything to change. The bullies thought they were in control until they weren't. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The moment the twins stepped onto the school grounds, their presence seemed to command the space in a way that was both subtle and profound. They walked with a quiet confidence that was undeniable yet unspoken. To the casual observer, they might have appeared as just two more students in a sea of faces blending in, their movements fluid and almost deliberate. But there was something different about them, something that made the people around them pause. Even if they didn't realize it, they didn't stand out in the way that would draw attention to themselves. They didn't need to. Their strength didn't lie in showing off. It was embedded in the way they moved, the way they held themselves. Steady, unwavering, calm in a world that often thrived on chaos. The bullies, on the other hand, were loud, boisterous, and overbearing. They walked with an air of entitlement, as if the world had no choice but to make way for them. Their presence was impossible to ignore, and they thrived on that attention. They were the kind of people who would push their way through crowds, shout over others, and assume that power came from dominance, from being the loudest, the biggest, the most intimidating. They believed their strength was a matter of force, and that was the fatal flaw in their thinking. When the bullies first set their sights on the twins, it was because they saw an opportunity. The twins, with their composed, quiet demeanor, were easy targets. The bullies thought that they could break them, that their silence was a sign of weakness. They assumed that if they pushed hard enough, said enough insulting words, or made enough threats, the twins would eventually react, either by cowering or fighting back in a way they could control. But they didn't understand who they were dealing with. To the bullies, the twins' calmness was the first clue that they were fragile. They didn't yell. They didn't flinch when their words hit like daggers. Instead, they simply walked on as if the taunts didn't even exist. It puzzled the bullies at first, then irritated them. How could anyone ignore them? How could anyone remain so unaffected? The more the bullies pressed, the more frustrated they became. They couldn't understand why their intimidation tactics weren't working. What the bullies failed to realize was that the twins had been conditioned for this very moment. They had trained in martial arts for years, not just to fight, but to learn discipline, control, and focus. The true essence of martial arts was not about brute force. It was about the ability to harness your strength, to remain in control, no matter the situation. It was about responding to aggression, not with anger or violence, but with a calm, centered presence. The twins had learned this from an early age. They understood that true power came from within. It wasn't about reacting to others or letting their actions dictate your own. The bullies had no idea that beneath the surface of calmness lay years of focused training. A well of discipline and control that made them far stronger than anyone could imagine. The twins were also aware of the game the bullies were playing. They had seen it time and time again. The loud ones, the aggressive ones, the ones who believed that strength came from intimidating others. But the twins didn't need to fall into that trap. They had mastered the art of silence, of standing firm and steady when others tried to push them into chaos. The bullies tried to draw them in with their taunts, their schvees, their crude gestures. But the twins stood still, unaffected. Their posture alone, straight back, shoulders relaxed but unwavering, spoke volumes. There was power in that stillness, a quiet strength that the bullies couldn't understand. They expected noise. They expected fear. But the twins offered nothing but a silent resistance, a force they could not see, but could feel. It was like trying to move a mountain by shouting at it, only to realize that the mountain didn't respond to noise. It didn't respond to force. It was immovable. And so were the twins. As the bullying escalated, the twins' response remained the same. Stillness, calmness, and a firm refusal to be rattled. The bullies grew angrier, they grew louder, their words became more vicious, their actions more desperate. But every move they made, every step they took toward the twins, only revealed how much power they had given away. The twins weren't reacting. The twins weren't afraid. They weren't flinching. And they weren't backing down. The bullies had no control. They didn't realize that they had already lost. In their frustration, they began to make mistakes. They overextended. They underestimated. And they ignored the simple truth. You cannot break someone who refuses to be broken. What the bullies failed to see was that their words and actions were not landing where they thought they were. They thought they could make the twins react, make them feel small, make them afraid. But the twins didn't react in the way they expected. Instead of shrinking under the pressure, they stood firm, unfazed, like an unshakable force of nature. The twins weren't giving in, and the bullies, in their inability to control the situation, began to realize just how little power they had. The twins didn't need to respond in kind. They didn't need to shout back or meet aggression with aggression. They had learned through their martial arts that strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about control, discipline, and resilience. The twins knew they could fight if they wanted to, but they didn't need to. They didn't need to prove their power. Their very presence, their unwavering calmness in the face of hostility was a testament to their strength. In the end, the bullies found themselves standing on the other side of the situation, confused, frustrated, and ultimately defeated by something they couldn't see or understand. They had tried to break the twins by force, but the twins had stood their ground with quiet, unyielding strength. The bullies had played their hand, and in doing so, had revealed their own weaknesses. The twins didn't need to fight back to win. They had already won simply by remaining calm, unshaken, and resolute in their own power. The air in the schoolyard was thick with tension. As soon as the twins walked past the group of bullies, the atmosphere shifted. It was the same every day. Whispers, snickers, and then the inevitable confrontation. But this time, it felt different. There was something about the way the bullies watched them. Something in the way they circled closer, sizing the twins up that hinted they weren't just going to settle for their usual taunts. They had decided that today would be different. They were going to break the calm, break the silence, force the twins to react. At first, the taunts started slow, mild teasing, snide remarks. Each one meant to poke at the twins, to prod them into doing something, anything. The bullies were used to their targets flinching, backing away, or at least showing some sign of discomfort. That was the goal, to make the other person feel small, weak, insignificant. And when the twins didn't flinch, when they didn't even acknowledge the words being thrown at them, the bullies knew they needed to escalate. They would push harder. They would be louder. The first shove came unexpectedly. It was a light push, just enough to unbalance the smaller of the twins, to see if they would stumble, to see if they would show fear. But the twin didn't stumble. They didn't even hesitate. They simply righted themselves, never breaking their stride. Their faces unreadable as ever. The bullies' expectations were dashed. They wanted a reaction, but none came. Frustration built in their eyes, and they pressed on. "Where are you going?" "Scared to walk through here." One of the bullies sneered, moving closer, blocking the twins' path. His voice was louder now, edged with something more sinister. "Think you're too good for this place? Too good for us?" The twins didn't even look at him. They didn't flinch at the tone, the accusation, the intimidation. They simply walked forward, ignoring the bullies' attempts to get under their skin. It wasn't that they didn't hear the words. They did. But they had learned long ago that responding to words like those gave them power. And they weren't about to hand that power over. They knew that the moment they engaged, the moment they reacted, they would give the bullies what they wanted. A fight, a reason to continue. But the bullies weren't going to let it go that easily. They were determined to make a scene, to break the calm. One of them pushed the other twin harder this time, enough to knock them back slightly. The twin took the push without even a wheeze, eyes never leaving the ground ahead. It wasn't that. They didn't feel the shove. It just didn't matter to them. They had been taught that in moments like these, power didn't come from responding to aggression. It came from silence, from stillness. They had learned that in martial arts, the most important battles were fought within, and they would never let someone else's actions dictate their response. But the bullies weren't willing to back down. They had expected the twins to react. They had expected them to be scared, to be vulnerable, to show that their calmness was just a facade. But the twins were too composed, too disciplined for that. So, the bullies stepped up the game, trying to provoke them in ways that were both louder and more aggressive. One of the bullies grabbed the arm of one of the twins, trying to yank them toward him, trying to force them to engage, to fight back. The bully thought that if he could make the twins feel cornered, feel trapped, they would have no choice but to fight. But once again, the twins did not react. The one twin who had been grabbed simply looked at the bully, but there was no fear, no anger, not even a flicker of surprise in their eyes. They just stood still. Their calmness, their unwavering composure sent a message that was louder than any words could. The bully didn't know how to handle it. He had seen plenty of kids who would lash out, who would throw a punch, or at the very least, scream back. But not the twins. They were immovable. This made the bullies even more desperate. They began to push and shove harder, trying to make the twins lose their calm. But the twins' strength wasn't in their reaction. It wasn't in their ability to retaliate or to make noise. Their strength came from their stillness. Their refusal to engage in the chaos the bullies were trying to create. They didn't react to the physical aggression. They didn't let the words get to them. They simply moved through the scene unwavering, unflinching. The more the bullies tried, the more frustrated they became. They were used to getting a rise out of people. They were used to controlling the situation, bending others to their will with their loud voices and harsh actions. But here in front of them was a pair of people who refused to be bent, refused to be broken by anything the bullies could do. It was an experience that was both infuriating and unsettling for the bullies. They had tried everything. They had called the twins names. They had shoved them. They had tried to provoke a reaction. But the twins stayed firm. And with each failed attempt, the bullies grew more desperate. Their words became more vicious. Their actions more exaggerated. They pushed harder. They yelled louder. They tried to get physical. But all the while, the twins stood their ground. They didn't give in. They didn't break. And most importantly, they didn't play the game the bullies were trying to draw them into. The twins' calmness, their refusal to react became their greatest weapon. The bullies who had believed that strength came from intimidation and force were now learning the hard way that true strength was found in discipline, in control, in the ability to remain unshaken no matter how hard someone pushed. The bullies had expected to dominate, to break the twin spirit, but instead they were faced with something they didn't know how to handle. Quiet, unshakable strength, and it left them powerless. The bullying had escalated, and the tension in the schoolyard was palpable. The bullies, having failed to break the twins with their verbal jabs and physical schvies, were at the end of their patience. Their attempts at intimidation had all fallen flat. The twins stood there unfazed like statues, their eyes focused on the path ahead, as if the world around them simply didn't matter. The bullies couldn't fathom it. Why weren't the twins reacting? Why didn't they lash out? It was as if their usual tactics were completely ineffective, but they weren't ready to give up. Not yet. The escalating frustration in the air hinted at a final act, one where they would make sure the twins understood who was in charge. One of the bullies, anger seeping through his every word, decided to take it a step further. "You think you can just walk away from this? That will just let you go," he sneered, stepping directly in front of the twins, blocking their path once again. The others circled in, surrounding the twins in a tight formation. The twins remained silent as always, their calmness infuriating the group. The longer they stayed quiet, the more the bullies' actions became reckless, each move fueled by the need to break the twins' unyielding composure. The bullies knew they needed to do something drastic to provoke them. They wanted a reaction, any reaction. And that's when it happened. The first twin, who had been standing still, turned to face one of the bullies. The shift was so subtle that it took a moment for anyone to register it. Their movement was controlled, deliberate, every step taken with the calm precision that had become their trademark. The bully who had been pushing the hardest now found himself face to face with someone who seemed entirely unbothered by his presence. There was no fear in their eyes, no hesitation, just quiet assurance. The bully didn't know what to do with it. He tried to push forward to shove the twin back into the crowd of jeering peers. But the moment the twin took a step, everything changed. A swift movement, fluid and almost imperceptible, and the bully was disarmed, his own momentum working against him. In a heartbeat, the bully found himself off balance. His hand yanked forward and twisted at an angle that made him gasp. The twin's calm demeanor hadn't shifted, but in that brief second, a quiet power had been unleashed. It was a movement that had been honed, refined over years of practice. A move so seamless, so quick that the bully didn't have the time to react before he found himself on the ground, looking up at the twins in shock. The other bullies froze, their mouths slightly agape, unable to process what had just happened. They had expected a fight. They had expected noise, shouting, and struggle. But instead, they had witnessed something entirely different. The twins didn't fight in the traditional sense. They didn't thrash around or make a scene. Instead, they moved with an efficiency and control that left the bullies completely disoriented. It wasn't just physical strength that had overpowered them. It was the quiet, almost meditative focus with which the twins moved. And just like that, the tension in the air shifted. The bullies who had been so sure of their control now found themselves questioning everything. They had come into the situation expecting to dominate, expecting the twins to react out of fear or frustration. But instead, they had been outmatched in a way they couldn't even understand. The twins hadn't even broken a sweat. They hadn't even raised their voices. They had simply done what they had been trained to do. Remain centered, focused, and in control. The remaining bullies looked at each other, their confidence starting to crumble. They had been too sure of themselves, too wrapped up in their belief that they could push around anyone they chose. The twins had demonstrated something the bullies couldn't comprehend. They had learned the art of self-discipline, of control, of never allowing outside forces to dictate how they would respond. And in that moment, the bullies realized they had underestimated their targets in the worst way. The twins didn't continue to press the advantage. They didn't need to. They simply stood there calm and steady, their presence enough to remind the bullies that they were no longer in control. The twins had made their point, and it had been done without the need for escalation, without the need for violence or rage. They had responded with efficiency, precision, and control, and that was far more powerful than anything the bullies could have expected. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence between the twins and the bullies stretched out, heavy with the weight of realization. The bullies had been so caught up in their own arrogance, so certain of their ability to dominate that they hadn't even considered the possibility that their actions could backfire. But now, as they looked at the twins, they understood something had shifted. The fight they had imagined wasn't the one they had walked into. It wasn't about strength or numbers. It wasn't about shouting or pushing. It was about the quiet power of someone who knew exactly who they were and had no intention of letting anyone take that away. The bullies had tried to break the twins to make them crumble under the weight of their aggression. But the twins had proven that strength didn't lie in responding to violence with more violence. It lay in control, in self-mastery, in the ability to stay calm in the face of everything that tried to break them. And in that moment, as the bullies backed down, it became clear that the twins hadn't just defeated them physically. They had defeated the very notion of power that the bullies had tried to wield. The twins stood their ground, unwavering, their composure intact. The bullies, on the other hand, began to realize they had been outclassed. In the silence that followed, it was clear who had emerged victorious. The twins didn't need to say a word. Their actions spoke louder than anything else could have. The aftermath of the confrontation left the schoolyard eerily quiet. The usual sounds of laughter, chatter, and chaos had been replaced with a heavy silence. The bullies, who had once been so confident in their ability to dominate the situation, now stood in stunned disbelief. The twins hadn't fought back with fury or anger, but with a calm, practiced control that was now impossible to ignore. And that was perhaps the most unsettling part, the fact that the twins had used their quiet strength as a weapon, and the bullies had no idea how to respond. As the bullies shuffled away, murmuring among themselves, the twins resumed their walk, their pace unchanged, their expressions neutral. It was as if nothing had happened, as though the scene that had just unfolded was of no consequence to them. But beneath the surface, there was an unmistakable air of confidence that clung to them. A kind of quiet resolve that anyone who had witnessed the event could feel. It wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. It was about something far deeper. The twins' ability to remain unshaken, to stay grounded no matter what the world threw at them. As the twins walked, they noticed the students around them were no longer whispering or pointing. Instead, they seemed to be watching them with a kind of awe. Some with curiosity, others with newfound respect. The twins hadn't just beaten the bullies physically. They had shattered an illusion. They had shown their peers that strength wasn't always about being loud or aggressive. It was about knowing who you were, having the discipline to control your reactions, and the awareness to handle the unexpected with grace. What many of the students failed to understand was that the twins had not just learned these lessons in the heat of the moment. Their ability to stay calm under pressure had been nurtured over years of hard work and dedication. It wasn't something that came easily, nor was it a skill that could be gained overnight. The twins had been trained to master not only their bodies, but their minds as well. They understood that the true test of strength wasn't in how hard you could punch or how loud you could yell. It was in your ability to remain centered, to keep your mind clear and focused no matter the external chaos. It was a lesson that had been instilled in them from a young age through martial arts training, through the practice of meditation, and through the understanding that inner peace was the key to overcoming any external obstacle. The twins' journey to mastering themselves hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when they questioned their path. But they had always returned to the core principles that had guided them. Discipline, patience, respect, and focus. They had learned to control not only their bodies, but their emotions, their impulses, and their thoughts. This wasn't just about self-defense. It was about self-mastery. And in that moment, as they walked away from the bullies, the twins knew that they had passed a test. Not because they had physically defeated anyone, but because they had stayed true to who they were. They had shown that quiet strength could overcome aggression, that peace could prevail over violence. The students who had witnessed the scene couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. The bullies had gone in expecting an easy win, expecting the twins to back down, to flinch under the weight of their aggression. But that's not what had happened. Instead, the bullies had found themselves outclassed by a calm, composed strength that they hadn't seen coming. And now, as the twins continued on their way, the atmosphere in the schoolyard had changed. The usual cliques, the usual social dynamics had been disrupted. People were thinking differently. They were looking at the twins with new eyes, seeing them not as targets to be bullied, but as individuals who possessed something much more powerful than physical strength. An unshakable sense of self. The bullies, on the other hand, were left to lick their wounds emotionally, not physically. Their pride had been bruised, their egos shattered. They had underestimated the twins, and in doing so, they had learned an important lesson. Aggression and intimidation were not always the tools that won battles. In fact, they had just witnessed how those tools could backfire, how they could be rendered utterly useless in the face of quiet, controlled power. But the twins weren't interested in gloating, in showing off their victory. They didn't need to. The most powerful statement they had made wasn't through their actions in the schoolyard. It was through the way they had carried themselves before, during, and after the confrontation. They had demonstrated something that most people didn't even realize existed. The ability to remain composed, to stay focused and disciplined, even in the most stressful of situations. And that was the true power they had wielded. An inner strength that had nothing to do with physicality and everything to do with self-awareness. As the twins walked away, they didn't feel the need to explain themselves, to tell anyone what had just happened. They didn't need anyone's approval or validation. The respect they had earned from their peers wasn't about fear or intimidation. It was about something far deeper. It was the quiet recognition of strength, of grace under pressure, of the understanding that true power comes from within. The twins' actions had rippled out through the school, leaving behind a quiet impact. People would talk about what had happened, but not in the way the bullies had hoped. They would talk about how the twins had handled themselves, how they had stayed calm in the face of aggression, and how their quiet strength had been enough to stop the bullies in their tracks. The message was clear. True power wasn't in the loudest voice or the biggest fist. It was in the ability to remain calm, focused, and centered no matter what chaos surrounded you. And in that, The twins had won something far more valuable than any fight could have given them. They had won respect. They had won peace. And most importantly, they had won the knowledge that no one, no matter how loud or aggressive, could ever take away their inner strength. The twins stood there, the sounds of the schoolyard fading into the background. They weren't the center of attention. They weren't looking for validation or even recognition. But the whispers had begun. Slowly, quietly, the murmurs spread among the students, traveling like ripples on a pond after a stone is thrown. It wasn't long before the air was thick with curiosity, respect, and something that the twins hadn't expected to feel in this moment, admiration. The bullies had failed to break them, and in doing so, the twins had unwittingly taught a powerful lesson that reached far beyond the schoolyard. As the twins made their way through the crowd, they noticed something they hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the usual classmates and friends that were now eyeing them with a new kind of respect. It was the other students, the ones who had kept to themselves, the ones who had watched quietly from the sidelines. They were looking at the twins in a way that made the twins pause for a moment, almost as if they could sense the shift in how they were being perceived. In the days that followed, things began to change. Conversations that had once revolved around the usual high school drama, who was dating whom, who had the best clothes, who was the most popular, now included something else. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was the quiet realization that strength didn't always look like strength. Some students began to look at the twins differently, not with fear, but with a newfound understanding. They started to see that strength could be calm, controlled, and patient. They saw that real power didn't come from force or dominance. It came from within, from a steady and unwavering belief in one's own abilities. It wasn't something that could be taken or given. It was something you carried with you regardless of the circumstances. The transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it entirely outward. The schoolyard chatter had subsided, but the changes in the students' attitudes were far more subtle. They began to take notice of how the twins carried themselves every day, even outside of the confrontation. They didn't walk through the halls with an air of arrogance or pride. Nor did they slink away in silence. They simply moved through the space around them, calm and confident, as if they were completely aware of who they were. The energy they gave off was undeniable, like a quiet presence that quietly asserted itself without ever raising a voice. And slowly, this new perception began to permeate the way others interacted with them. Students who had once ignored the twins or treated them as invisible started to acknowledge their existence. They began to engage them in conversations, not with the same kind of forced politeness or awkwardness that often came from not knowing how to relate to someone, but with real interest. They wanted to know more about the twins' quiet strength, the way they had handled the confrontation with such poise. Some of these students had been in similar situations, victims of bullies ignored by their peers, but had never known how to respond, how to stand up for themselves without falling into anger or violence. The twins had unwittingly opened a door for them, showing that there was another way, a way that didn't require losing control or becoming a part of the very system of aggression that had been used to hurt them. The message was clear. Strength wasn't about being the loudest. It wasn't about having the biggest muscles or the most power. It was about being able to face adversity without letting it change who you were. What the students didn't realize, though, was that this wasn't just about the twins' handling of the bullies. It was about their entire way of being their entire lives. They had been taught to move through the world without being swayed by the expectations of others. They had been taught that true strength came from within, that it wasn't about impressing others or fitting into the mold that society tried to impose. It was about knowing who you were, being true to yourself, and never allowing anyone or anything to make you feel less than you were. It was a message that resonated deeply with the students who had always felt as though they were too different, too quiet, too out of place to truly fit in. The twins' actions had sparked something much larger than just a momentary victory over a group of bullies. They had shown an entire school that there was power in self-control, in discipline, and in quiet assurance. The bullies had thought that by using force and aggression, they could push the twins into submission. They thought they could make them feel small, inferior, and powerless. But the twins had taught everyone a different lesson. They had shown that real strength didn't come from the ability to push others around. It came from knowing that you could handle whatever was thrown at you without resorting to the same tactics of aggression and fear that others used to gain control. This realization began to sink in over the days that followed. Students who had once been part of the crowd of onlookers started to shift their behavior. They stopped relying on their fists or words to solve problems. They started to think more before reacting, to pause and reflect on what their actions would lead to. They began to understand that there was more to power than just brute force. And in that understanding, something profound began to happen. A quiet shift. A new sense of self-awareness began to take hold. It wasn't just the twins who had changed. It was the entire atmosphere of the school. A shift toward something more mindful, more introspective, and less concerned with proving oneself at the expense of others. The bullies, meanwhile, began to fade into the background. The confidence they had once worn so proudly started to crumble, and their actions became more desperate, less effective. Without the response they had expected, without the anger and frustration they had tried to provoke, they were left to stew in their own confusion. Their attempts at bullying no longer had the same power over the students they had once controlled. The quiet power that the twins had demonstrated had, in essence, made the very tools of bullying irrelevant. The bullies didn't know how to proceed when their intimidation no longer had any impact. The world they had once ruled had shifted, and they found themselves on the outside looking in. The twins, on the other hand, continued to carry themselves with the same quiet assurance. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They didn't need to boast or show off their abilities. They simply continued to walk through their days with the same calmness, unaffected by the changes around them. They didn't need the validation of others to know their own worth. And in that, they had already won. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of the twins' actions became undeniable. It wasn't just about what had happened in that one moment. It wasn't just about the bullies who had been put in their place or the students who had witnessed the confrontation. It was about something much deeper. It was about the lessons that had been learned, not through words, but through actions. The twins had quietly and without seeking attention taught the entire school that true strength isn't defined by the loudest voice or the biggest display of power. Instead, it's found in quiet control, in unshakable self-awareness, and in the ability to handle adversity with grace. What was truly remarkable was that this shift wasn't something that could be traced to a single event. It wasn't a transformation that could be measured by the immediate reactions of the students. It was something that lingered, something that settled deeply into the culture of the school. The idea that strength could be quiet, could be controlled, was a revelation to many who had only known power in the form of aggression or dominance. For the first time, students began to realize that they didn't have to shout to be heard, that they didn't need to strike to be strong. This wasn't just about the twins showing resilience in the face of bullying. It was about them demonstrating an unshakable sense of self that couldn't be undermined by the actions or opinions of others. They had faced down a challenge, but it wasn't their physical skill or strength that had made the difference. It was their confidence, their calmness, their ability to stand firm in who they were. And that lesson was far more powerful than any physical confrontation could ever be. As the weeks went by, the school's atmosphere began to change. The usual dynamics of power and intimidation that once dominated the halls were now challenged by a growing sense of respect for self-control and inner strength. The students who had once been bystanders to the bullying now began to reframe their own understanding of what it meant to be strong. Some began to reflect on their own actions and attitudes, considering how they could carry themselves with more confidence and poise. Others found themselves inspired to stand up for others, not with aggression or force, but with dignity, calm, and quiet authority. The bullies, too, began to learn. Though they had initially retreated in shock, their understanding of power had been permanently altered. No longer could they rely on their old methods of intimidation. The quiet strength they had encountered in the twins had shown them that aggression could only take them so far. They had tried to assert dominance, but in the end, it had been the twins' quiet, composed resilience that left a lasting impression. And as for the twins, they remained as they always had been, unmoved by the shifting tides of approval or condemnation. They knew who they were. They didn't need to prove themselves to anyone. They had already shown the world their strength, not through force, but through the quiet power of being true to themselves. They had set an example without ever seeking to do so. And that example would stay with their peers long after the incident had faded from memory. The true legacy of that day wasn't the defeat of the bullies. It wasn't even the newfound respect they had earned. It was the understanding that had been instilled in everyone who witnessed the event. That real strength lies not in how loudly you can shout or how hard you can strike, but in your ability to stand your ground with quiet dignity, to face adversity with grace, and to never let anyone define your worth. The twins had shown that power could be silent. And in doing so, they had transformed not just a single confrontation, but an entire school's perspective on what it truly meant to be. Sometimes, the loudest message is spoken without a single word. These twins didn't fight for attention. They didn't react out of rage. They stood their ground with discipline, patience, and the quiet strength that only comes from knowing who you are. And in doing so, they reminded everyone watching that true power isn't about domination, it's about self-mastery. At Soulful Stories V, we share stories that move hearts and open minds. If this story left you thinking about strength, dignity, or how we treat each other, please give it a like, leave us a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. Is silence a sign of weakness, or the ultimate form of strength?